Hello and welcome to a new episode of SPC Conversations. My name is Greg Rose, and I serve as Vice President and a member of the Board of Directors of Solidarity with the Persecuted Church. SPC's mission is to help the Christian Church persevere in areas of the world where it faces religious persecution, working with local church leaders to promote sustainability, resist persecution, and increase awareness of their plight here in the United States. We are delighted to have as our guest my dear friend Shannen Coffin, partner at the international law firm Steptoe LLC and chair of their Appeals and Advocacy practice. Shannen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Greg. Look forward to having this conversation.
Shannen is well known in Washington as one of the leading federal appellate lawyers in the United States, with decades of experience handling critical litigation involving the entire panoply of federal and constitutional law. In fact, we first met years ago when we were working together on legislation to reform the federal criminal justice system and increase religious freedom protections in the United States. Shannen has also brought his brilliant legal talent and mind to the highest corridors of power in the federal government. For example, serving at the White House as counsel to U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney, advising on constitutional, national security, and congressional matters. And you, Shannen, earlier served at the U.S. Department of Justice as Deputy Assistant Attorney General, overseeing litigation involving constitutional challenges to federal statutes and programs. Shannen continues to serve our country as a top lawyer who is willing to take on a pro bono basis, which means not getting paid, critical cases involving our most cherished constitutional protections, as embodied in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And Shannen understands the deep interconnections between religious freedom abroad and here in the United States. So let's begin the discussion with a critical First Amendment case that strikes at the heart of religious freedom here in the United States, Wall Builders v. WMATA. Shannen, could you give our audience an overview of the case and of how it's been resolving itself?
Sure, Greg. We brought a case about a little over a year ago in the District of Columbia against the Washington metro system, the public transit system here, on behalf of a group called Wall Builders that wanted to advertise on WMATA buses and on WMATA property their religious mission. Wall Builders is a group that believes and wants to educate the public about the role that religious beliefs, especially Christianity, played in the founding of our country. So if you go to wallbuilders.com, their website, you'll find a lot of quotes from the founders about the importance of religious belief in our democracy. So Wall Builders wanted to advertise that message on WMATA buses, and they were told no by WMATA. They were told no because their message was too controversial. WMATA has policies that prohibit advertising on messages where there are divided opinion on issues, which of course in the United States you could find divided opinions on just about every issue under the sun. WMATA also has policies prohibiting any advertisement that promotes or opposes religious belief or religious practices. So we brought a lawsuit against WMATA on behalf of Wall Builders, myself joined by a group called First Liberty, which focuses on First Amendment religious liberties and religious speech, and by the ACLU, who are also representing Wall Builders, which is a sort of unique right-left combination here. And we brought a suit challenging Wall Builders, challenging WMATA's policies, that both their religious speech policy, their anti-religious speech policy, and the policy about public opinion, divided public opinion. These would be what they call their issue ad ban. And we brought a suit in the District of Columbia, and to date have been successful. We got a preliminary injunction a few months ago that enjoined the application of the issue ad ban against our client, and we continue to fight on the religious ad ban.
Well, as you know, I learned about your having been the lead counsel on this case when we were sitting in a cafe talking about other matters when a bus went by with in big letters, Christianity question mark. And you pointed to that with, I must say, appropriate pride, because it was an extraordinary success, at least at this stage, that you helped make that happen. And it was then led to a whole conversation about that case, about the First Amendment issues involved. And of course, you learn more about our involvement at SPC and what we're doing abroad on religious freedom. And one of our top helpers, advisors, and someone we've invited to appear on the podcast is Professor Bob Destro of Catholic University Law School, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights. And we had a podcast, wonderful conversation with him. And he, of course, has been a leader on the international religious freedom issue. But early on the whole U.S. religious freedom issue, which, as you know, really didn't have the kind of scholarly examination that it required until the 1980s and 90s, when people really understood what was happening in that area. So having read your December 2023 complaint that you filed in the U.S. District Court for D.C., one of the telling things about the case is that the Washington Transit Authority nowhere enforced an explicit policy to censor speech specifically directed at Christians. And in other words, one of the things that I found interesting was that was the consequence of what they were actually doing. But all too often, as you know, in the United States, religious speech is censored on supposedly non-religious grounds. For example, public safety, I think of the heckler's veto, or avoiding offense on the part of certain groups and so on. And yet those censoring religious speech will deny to no end that they are targeting religious speech. And I imagine this must only increase the challenge that you, as an advocate and a lawyer trying to fight for protections of these speech, in battling this unconstitutional censorship. And I'm wondering, is that one of the ways this is done, and how does one deal with that?
Well, it's a very good question, and it plays into this litigation. WMATA is defending its ban on religious speech on the grounds of offense, on the grounds of the heckler's veto. And the particular incident that started all of this in about 2015 was an effort by a conservative group to put up ads insulting the Muhammad and Islam. And the concern at the time was that the followers of Muhammad would naturally riot and burn down the city, which of course is fairly offensive to that religious practice. But the belief was, and the concern was that that Washington buses had to be safe, that anyone could take offense at any particular ad that had religious views, and in the broader context, any issue, any public issue on which people might take offense or might have a different view. So they just banned the whole field. In practice, the legal issue that comes to the fore here is that is discrimination against religious speech. Now, the First Amendment doubly protects religious speech. There's First Amendment protections for the freedom of religion, but the First Amendment speech clause also protects religious speech as a subject matter. And the concern here is that WMATA is discriminating against a particular viewpoint, a particular, that for instance, Christianity isn't just a subject matter on which people will address yay or nay, but Christianity or Judaism or any particular religious practice is a viewpoint is a prism through which to see the world. So we don't just have a subject matter that you're either pro or against religion, but on topics of abortion, on topics of the very controversial topics of the day, on same-sex marriage and issues like that, you have religious viewpoints. So when you are banning speech that either promotes or opposes a particular religious viewpoint, you are engaging in viewpoint discrimination. What the courts have said, or what the DC Circuit has said in this particular space, is no, that religion is a particular subject matter, and in a non-public or limited public forum like the side of a bus, the government can take particular subject matters off the table. The government could say, we're not going to have any speech about abortion on our buses. We're not going to have any speech about same-sex marriage on our buses. We're not going to have any speech about particular subject matters. And what the court has said, and what we're trying to get at and challenge, is the principle that religion is just another subject matter that can be taken off the table. It's not. It's very much a way of seeing the world, and you're engaging not just in discrimination about subjects, but about viewpoints, which is the most protected sort of speech under the First Amendment.
Right, and one of the things that is striking about the trends we're now seeing, even in, let's say, law school constitutional articles and examinations of the First Amendment, is the First Amendment itself under assault. People advocating for a constitutional amendment to basically defang the First Amendment protection of free speech. But it's always striking to me that those assaults on the First Amendment are usually targeted at specific content speech. They don't want to stop all free speech. It's just certain types of speech. And I think in today, it's religious speech that's definitely being targeted in these moves. And I guess that raises the question, going back to the founding fathers, the drafters of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, why is the First Amendment so important? Hard to believe that we'd have to explain that, but I think it's important to talk about. And why is religious freedom protected in the First Amendment so importantly, and why is it doubly protected? Why is our society better with that being protected by our Constitution?
It's a big question, and gets at the fundamentals of our country. And why is the First Amendment the First Amendment, right? But especially as illustrated by this case, we don't want the government picking sides on what, and you're seeing a lot of that now, as to what speech is permitted and what speech is not. And where you're seeing it in particular is this notion, you hear it all the time now, and it's not a phrase you heard 10 years ago: disinformation and misinformation. That's the guise in which we're supposed to pick winners and losers in our public discourse. And when the government steps in and starts shutting off one side of a debate, they're cutting off discourse that's important to our government and how we govern ourselves. This is a republic. People vote based on information, and the government shouldn't serve generally as a filter for what information is permitted and what information isn't. Now, there are limits on that. You know about libel law, and you can't defame someone falsely and knowingly, but there's liability for that. But generally speaking, we as Americans need information, the best information from all sides, for us to decide individually how we're going to govern ourselves. And the First Amendment's critical to that democratic republic process taking place. And as to religious speech, well, you know, people want the government out of religion entirely. You know, the sort of the Jeffersonian strict separation folks want the government out of religion entirely, but often that goes a step beyond that and tries to take religion out of public discourse entirely. And you know, we are historically a religious country. We have our republic is, you know, set up on sort of Judeo-Christian principles, and to choke that out of our discourse, to choke that out of the public square, would do, you know, grievous harm to our culture, to our society, to our laws. Our laws, you know, have been historically based on those principles. Doesn't mean they're the only principle that's in play, nor should it be. I think they should be; those principles should be tested in the public square. But the government playing a role of just shutting it out entirely, while allowing speech on the same subject matter from a secular viewpoint, means that the public is only hearing, you know, one side of the story.
Well, that's a powerful explanation for what's at play here. And I urge our viewers who aren't familiar with it to read one of the great books of philosophy that defends what now we call in the United States the First Amendment, which is John Stuart Mill, the British philosopher, On Liberty, where he coins the expression the marketplace of ideas to talk about how allowing ideas to compete in the open with debate allows better outcomes to come in a society, and allows people to vent and express their views on all sorts of issues. Democracy without that, a free society without that, is not free. And I think that that's what is at issue here, especially with religious speech. Now let's talk about the international situation, which is in fact interconnected with this. Now, of course, one has to be extremely careful in comparing religious freedom and the threats to it here in the United States to what people are facing, Christians are facing, and others in places like Iraq and Syria, in Iran, Nigeria, and China. You know, in these other countries, Christians are being driven out of their homes, being imprisoned for their beliefs, in some cases being killed for their Christian faith. Keeping in mind that difference in magnitude, nevertheless, there are commonalities in the suppression of religious freedom, especially of Christians, both here and abroad. And these commonalities contribute, I would argue, to the desensitization on the part of many Americans about what is happening to Christians abroad. You know, as we discussed about here in the United States, for example, we talked about this, we see in many countries around the world that persecution of Christians and other religious minorities is often masked behind supposed justifications that don't involve actually specifically Christians. So let's talk about Nigeria, which is a special concern of the United States, and a special concern, I should say, for SPC. Nigeria, as you know, is the country, more than any country in the world right now, where most Christians are being killed for their faith. Even worse than what's happening now in the Middle East. And so many in the international community that supposedly cares about persecuted minorities, so many are going out of the way to deny the reality there. And I guess you have some awareness of what's happening in Nigeria, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, of course, the Roman Catholic Church is, you know, is prevalent in Nigeria, and it's also Catholic priests are being killed left and right in that country. And as you note, that is at least, you know, a greater physical threat than a lot of Christians are facing at this point. And we have First Amendment freedoms to protect us. But I was at a Catholic church in Frisco, Texas, about 2 years ago, and having worked for the Vice President of the United States, I sort of have a pretty good sense of when there's security around, when, you know, guys who look like former Secret Service who are doing private protection, which means that they're, you know, when you see these guys, you know, with the headphones and speaking into their sleeves, you have a general sense that there's someone pretty, important, a politician, or a billionaire who's got his own protection nearby. And I was coming out of Mass at this church where a Nigerian priest had just said Mass, and I realized very quickly the subject of their protection was the priest. This is a Nigerian priest who's visiting from Nigeria in Texas and has to have armed security in the church to protect them. That's just stunning, right? I mean, that gives you a sense of what these guys are facing every day in their home country when, in Frisco, Texas, they have to have 3-4 security guys at the back of church to protect them from harm that's going to reach into the United States. It's just stunning.
It is, and of course, the whole issue of protection, even of a Nigerian priest in the United States, becomes complicated because of the issues that are happening here, where there's a desire to deny that there is this kind of threat, even here, to the extent that a Nigerian priest here is feeling they have to have that kind of level of security. Another commonality, by the way, I think we could say is true about the domestic situation here in the United States and what's happening abroad, is the suppression or supposed limiting of religious freedom to anything other than to religious practice within the home or in your church. In other words, the denial of the public square as a place to express your religious beliefs. And maybe you can hold religious ceremonies, but in your home, perhaps in a church, depending on the country, but certainly not in the public square in a number of countries in the world. And Shannen, as you know, we discussed suppressing religious freedom in the public square here in the U.S. is in and of itself an assault on religious freedom of Christians and other groups suffering from this kind of restriction. And maybe you could say a little bit about the religious practice issue, because obviously the bus case, the public transportation case, was strictly about signs that expressed some level of religious belief. How does religious practice fit into this, and what are the protections that the United States Constitution does provide to that kind of practice?
Sure. I mean, there is basic protection for, freedom of choice of religion, to practice your faith in the Constitution, separate and apart from the First Amendment speech protections. Where you're seeing this play out, you saw this play out in COVID, where the quarantine laws were applied to a ridiculous extent to keep people out of churches. At the same time that gatherings and other settings were perfectly fine. I mean, the District of Columbia, and I may be wrong about the exact number, but I'm fairly certain that the District of Columbia at one point said you could have no more than 10 people gather for a religious ceremony, for a mass at a church. It's insane, where people were allowed to go to the grocery store without limit as long as you were social distancing and doing whatever. You could go to Walmart, but you can only have 10 people attend mass, which drove people online at best, or just out of church entirely. And when those things were challenged, they collapsed on their own weight. There were injunctions across the country that said, and this is the discrimination principle. You can't treat religion worse than other exemptions you allow. So if you have a public gathering law that says during COVID only 10 people can gather in a church, it better say that as to Walmart and to Costco and everything else, right? So what these generally liberal and by that I mean progressive liberal jurisdictions were doing were using the justification of COVID to shut down religious practice and to target it. And the court has been very serious about preventing that sort of discrimination. that you can't, and this happened a couple of years ago in a case called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, where Philadelphia was saying to Catholic Charities, no, you're out. You can't participate in our foster system because you don't accept the secular Bible about same-sex marriage. And the Supreme Court, there's been a long-standing case that's been problematic in this area that dealt with peyote and religious practices out of Oregon. An opinion actually written by Justice Scalia, which is, it would surprise a lot of people today, that basically said that there can't be general religious exemptions from generally applicable laws. So you don't get an exemption to smoke peyote if that practice is generally unlawful. What that has led to a lot of attacks on religion of the nature of the quarantine laws that I mentioned. What the Supreme Court said in Fulton, though, in the context of this foster care issue is, yeah, it's true. Our rule has generally been that there are no religious exemptions from generally applicable laws, but what's a generally applicable law? Well, if there's any exemption to anything given to anyone, it has to also be provided to religion. So in the case of, say, the COVID quarantine laws, if you're allowing 100 people to gather at your local grocery store, you have to allow that for religious practice. So look, there's a sense that state and federal government agencies, are attacking religion more fiercely these days than in the past, or akin to some of the darker times in our history, I should say. But the good news is the courts have been protective. We do have a Supreme Court that is very protective of religious practices. So Coach Kennedy, in Washington, who lost his job for praying privately on the 50-yard line after a football game, got his job back because the Supreme Court said you can't do that. Fulton, the city of Philadelphia's foster care practice was found unconstitutional. But, in this lawfare world, the burden of litigating time and time again is enough to quiet people down, and, the progressives understand that.
Well, and it is striking that what for people of faith, and I'm not just talking about Christianity, gathering for prayer, gathering in the case of Christians for the Eucharist, for communion, is a critical part of life. And there seems to be a presumption among many in government that these are not critical parts of life, and that maybe going to a bar is more critical, or getting liquor or some other activity that they view as more important than religious activity. And it's not just Christians. As you know, the state of New York was targeting Orthodox Jewish communities that needed a minimum number of people for the prayer service to be proper. And they were not able, that minyan violated the very, very limited number of people they were allowing to gather in these spaces, in these synagogues. And regarding the international side, it is striking how many parallels there are. And I think another part of the problem is that in the West, in the United States and Europe, this trend here has, as I said, desensitized people in the West to what's happening to Christians in places like Africa and the Middle East, in China and elsewhere. And I like to say that international and domestic religious freedom are two sides of the same coin, and I think that may sum up what we're talking about here. And Shannen, with that important observation that you've made and about this, we've reached the end of this edition of SPC Conversations. Our guest has been Shannen Coffin, chair of the Appeals and Advocacy Group at Steptoe LLC. Thank you, Shannen. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you for your time, Greg.
And to our listeners, we will be back soon with more inspiring conversations. I look forward to seeing you the next time and wishing you well, and thank you for supporting our mission.